Hello and welcome back to Beyond the IEP with Dr. D. If you're a pre-service teacher trying to figure out what this thing called a PLAAFP is, you're in the right place. Maybe you are an in-service teacher who's working and you've opened up a PLAAFP and you think this doesn't tell me anything about this student. Or maybe you're a parent whose child is eligible for the first time for special education and you're just trying to figure out what this IEP process is and what this first step in the IEP is. If you have those questions, you're not alone. You know, PLAAFPs are one of the most misunderstood and sometimes most poorly written sections of the IEP. Well, in today's video, we're going to fix that. We're going to talk about what a PLAAFP actually is, what must be included, and where your data should come from. We're also going to look at what strong versus weak PLAAFP language looks like. And so by the end of this video, you'll know how to write a PLAAFP that is clear, compliant, and instructionally meaningful. Hi, I'm Dr. D. I'm a recently retired special education professor, and in the last 38 years I've served as a general education teacher, special education teacher, and an educational diagnostician and special ed director. I've worn a lot of hats, but I've had the privilege of working with many students, parents, and other professionals. So let's get into what the very first section of an IEP is, and that is a PLAAFP. So let's talk about what a PLAAFP stands for. A PLAAFP stands for Present Levels of Academic Achievement and Functional Performance. The PLAAFP describes what the student can currently do. It tells us about the student and what they know. It also tells us how they function in the school environment. So I want you to think of a PLAAFP as a snapshot in time. It's based on the data that we have right now, and it sets this foundation for the IEP. So if our PLAAFP is vague, or it's outdated, or it's unclear, our goals won't be measurable, our services won't be justified, progress monitoring won't make any sense. So a strong IEP begins with a strong PLAAFP. So, what must be included in a PLAAFP? Well, there are 5 required components that must be clearly documented in the IEP in every PLAAFP. And we're going to walk through each one. And I'm going to give you some clear, compliant examples so you can hear exactly what it should sound like. So let's start off with the first thing that must be included in a PLAAFP, and that are the strengths that the student possesses. Every PLAAFP must identify student strengths. Now, strengths are not personality traits. They're skills or abilities that support learning. So let me give you an example of a weak strength listed in a PLAAFP. He's motivated and he tries hard. That doesn't help instructionally. Here are some strong strength examples. Susan demonstrates strong visual memory skills and accurately recalls information presented using graphic organizers and visual supports. Here's another example. Jose reads grade level sight words with 95% accuracy and demonstrates strength in decoding single syllable words. Of both of those strong statements, you saw that they were specific, they were observable, and they were useful for instruction. Along with our strengths, we also talk about weaknesses and skill deficits. So a weakness describes skills that have not been mastered. So here's an example of a weak PLAAFP statement looking at weaknesses. Susan struggles with math. That doesn't tell the team anything about what to teach. I don't know anything about what is it she struggles with. Is it addition, subtraction, multiplication, fractions? So here's a stronger example of what should be included. Susan demonstrates difficulty solving multi-step word problems. And she has trouble with complexity of those word problems, accurately completing only 2 out of 8 problems on a recent classroom assessment. That gives me strong data to use. Here's another example. Susan has difficulty organizing written responses and often omits key details when writing paragraphs independently. So we want to make sure that our weakness statements identify the exact skill gap, and that helps lead us directly to the measurable goal that we have to write. Along with academic performance, we also talk about functional performance. Functional performance describes how you function in the school environment, especially related to attention, organization, behavior, communication, or even independence. So let me give you an example of a weak functional statement. Susan has difficulty paying attention in class. That doesn't tell me anything. For one teacher, paying attention in class might mean looking at the teacher when he or she is talking. For another teacher, that might mean that the student is always looking down at their paper and writing. So that's very subjective. That was very subjective and it was unmeasurable. So here are some strong functional performance examples. During independent work periods, observation data collected over the last 4 weeks shows that Susan remains on task for an average of 6 out of 15 minutes without adult prompts. Here's another one. Susan requires frequent redirection to follow multi-step classroom routines and benefits from visual schedules and verbal reminders. Those examples were observable, measurable, and context-based, and we always want to make sure that's what happens in our functional performance statement. Along with those weaknesses and those strengths and talking about functional performance, we also have to look at our data-based statements. Our PLAAFPs must be grounded in current objective data. Current objective data. Here's an example of a weak data statement. Testing shows Susan is behind. That doesn't tell me anything. Behind in what? A third grade reading passage? Is she behind in multi-step word problem solving? That tells me nothing. So here's an example of a strong data-based example. Based on curriculum-based measurements collected in September, Susan read 62 words correct per minute on a third grade passage compared to the grade level expectation of 110 words per minute. That gives me lots of data to help me build an appropriate objective when I'm getting ready to write a goal for her. Here's another example. Classroom writing samples collected over 6 weeks show that Susan writes an average of 3 complete sentences per paragraph with limited supporting details. Lots of data. Data-based statements establish a clear baseline for progress monitoring. We have to progress monitor our students, and to be able to do that, we have to have effective data statements. Another thing that is included in the PLAAFP are educational needs. Educational needs explain what the student needs to learn next based on the data. So here's a weak example of an educational need. Susan needs to improve reading. Well, that's way too broad. That doesn't tell me. Is it reading comprehension? Is it decoding? Is it problems with phonological processing? What is it that she needs to improve in? So here's an example of a strong example of that. Susan needs explicit instruction in reading fluency and multisyllabic words decoding to improve comprehension of grade level text. Here's another example. Susan requires instruction in paragraph organization and sentence expansion to improve written expression. You always have to remember that those needs should be skill-specific, instructional, and directly aligned to the goals that we're going to write. So where does this data come from for writing this PLAAFP? Well, if we're writing good PLAAFPs, we are building that foundation on multiple data sources, not just a test score. So some of those data sources could include initial or reevaluation of testing. So if the student's been assessed for a learning disability, we can use the assessment results to help us plan our PLAAFPs. It could come from curriculum-based measurements used in the classroom or classroom assessments. It could come from teacher observations or student work samples or parent input. It could come from input from the student if it's appropriate. It could come from related service provider reports. The thing to remember is that high-quality PLAAFPs blend together all these sources to tell a clear story of the child. So let's take a look at some good and not so good examples of PLAAFPs. So here's a weak PLAAFP example. Susan is below grade level in reading and needs support. So that I see no data, no skills, no direction. So let's turn that into a strength or a strong PLAAFP statement. Based on curriculum-based measurement data, Susan reads 62 words per minute correct on a grade level passage compared to the expected benchmark of 110 words per minute. And Susan demonstrates strength in her decoding single syllable words, but she has difficulty with multisyllabic words and reading fluency. So in that example, I'm using data. I'm identifying not only the strengths but also the weaknesses. And all of that information is going to help lead me to instruction for what she needs. Now, how do these PLAAFPs that we have connect to our goals? Well, here's a rule for every IEP team to follow. If it's not in the PLAAFP, it shouldn't be a goal, because PLAAFPs establish our baseline. They also justify the goals. That PLAAFP statement drives our services and our support services. And when those PLAAFPs are written well, goals almost write themselves. So some common mistakes that we have to really make sure we avoid include copying old PLAAFPs without updating data. I've seen that over and over again, just using the same PLAAFP statements every year. Well, the student makes changes every year, so I've got to make sure that my PLAAFP statements are up to date with current data. I've seen them using vague language, so you need to be very specific when you're providing data in your PLAAFP statement. Maybe it just lists scores without any interpretation. You've got to interpret the scores to let you know what it is the student's having challenges in so that you can write a good goal. Maybe it's writing goals that don't match the PLAAFP. We see that many times as well. Or maybe just forgetting to ignore functional performance and not even including that in the IEP. So a strong PLAAFP should always allow any educator to pick it up and to understand what this student needs immediately. That's the key. So, PLAAFPs are not just paperwork to be done. They're the foundation of the IEP. They're the roadmap that we use for instruction to tell us where we're going with this student. They're the key to help us monitor progress so we can see that the student's making meaningful progress toward their goal. So when PLAAFPs are clear, and when PLAAFPs are clear, everything in that IEP improves. If this video helps you, be sure to like and subscribe and share. And as always, remember, special education is not paperwork. It is turning compliance into clarity. It's people and procedures.